From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And during our first half hour today, a visit with K-State's A.J. Tarpoff, looking at turning cows and calves out on that crop residue following the harvest, and the potential herd health issues that could result from that grazing, accented this year by the weather delays in harvest, including toxicity from prussic acid, high nitrate levels, and mold on corn ears and grain sorghum heads. AJ will talk about taking management measures to assure that none of those result in cattle losses. And later on today, K-State's Charlie Lee is back this week to report on a new study of coyote attacks on dogs. He'll talk about what you pet owners should do to protect your animals from that threat. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You are listening to the K-State Radio Network. Glad to have you aboard once again for Agriculture Today. Well, we are slogging our way through the fall harvest here in Kansas, and once those crops are taken in, many of you cattle producers will be eyeing the crop residue as a potential nutritional resource for your herds. But as our guest will affirm today, there are even more than normal risks associated with grazing that crop stover. A.J. Tarpoff is with us, beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension, and we're going to walk through quite a series of things, AJ, that might turn up out there. This is, you say, somewhat unprecedented, this broad swath of potential problems.
Well, we've had an interesting year. I'll just put it that way. Okay, so we started off in a heavy drought, and then we dealt with flooding issues. Okay, so we have stressed crops that, we did get some regrowth on, but now all of a sudden we're getting some, relatively early frost. So we're starting to, not necessarily killing frost, but we are getting some earlier frosts that are stressing the plants that may not have gone into a winter kill yet. So we went from drought, we have the sunshine, we have frost, we have all these things kind of working together against us, so to speak, and it does bring up some potential risks. I think the first one, the blatant one that we need to talk about is we've had some pretty big storms. Right. Okay, we've had high winds that dumping 6-7 inches of rain in certain areas of the state. We've got some crop damage. Okay, we have crops that fell over, right? Especially with some of the high winds that we know we have quite a bit of grain laying on the ground that our combines couldn't pick up. So, yes, can we utilize some of that grain by feeding our livestock and letting them graze? Yes, but that comes at a risk. Okay, we always have to think about acidosis. And acidosis, for those of you that, haven't really thought about acidosis in your cow herd, it really happens that cattle eat too much grain all at one time. Cattle will selectively feed. If we turn them out into a stubble field, regardless if we're talking about milo or corn, we turn cattle out, they will selectively graze and find that grain and consume large amounts. Okay, and when that happens, it changes the fermentation process on the inside of the rumen. And what happens is we get a huge, massive acid dump on the inside of the rumen. And that can be very detrimental to that animal. Okay, we can run into, acute ruminal acidosis that can lead to bloat. Over time, through the grazing season, we can end up with some pretty sore, pretty stiff cows that are actually foundering. Okay, so we get laminitis in both the front and the rear feet, that we get some severe lameness coming out of these girls. So we have to be cognizant of that. Later term stages that founder, we unless aggressive foot trimming, we don't always have a cure for that. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is liver abscesses. We can give liver abscesses to a grazing animal, similar to what we would see in the feedlot, just by over-consuming some of these grains that are left over in the field. So be cognizant of that. Having a realistic expectation of how many bushels of grain was left over in the field.
You need to get out there and do a rough eyeball sampling.
A rough eyeball sampling and, work with your county agent. Many of our agents have been out there and can get a pretty good estimate of how much grain is left over. Okay, it's not just the corners where the combine turns, but if we've had especially some true damage from storms, yes, we can have quite a bit. A rough estimate, if we've got over 10 bushels an acre still out in the field, we can run into some acidosis issues. So bear that in mind. It doesn't mean that we can't utilize it, but it may take some more management so we do utilize that in a little bit safer method. Whether we start feeding some rumensin or monensin to help regulate the feed intake to ensure that they're not binge consuming some of these grains. Electric fencing goes a long way that we can actually control, and we can kind of do swath grazing so we don't let them overconsume, that we can control how much they consume on a daily basis. So these are things to think about with acidosis.
So there's one potential problem that can be managed through if one stays alert to the conditions out there. One of the others that's being talked up quite a bit, AJ, the concern over prussic acid buildup in these stands, and this has a lot to do with harvest delays and varying temperatures and so forth.
Yeah, harvesting delays, varying temperatures. This is where we get a little bit more species specific. We're really talking about a lot of our sorghum, Sudan, or hybrid type, crops that we may have. So what happens is whenever these plants in particular, they get stressed by some means. Okay, they will build up these prussic acid, or what's also referred to as hydrogen cyanide, inside the leaves. Okay, so it's there, but they will dissipate over time. So this is one good thing that we have at our disposal is just because, a group of plants may be at risk, if we wait a period of time, it'll get better over time.
The question is when to turn out.
Right. So the at-risk times are, number one, new sprouts. Okay. You just went in, harvested milo, and all of a sudden we've got some rain, some hot sunny days that are over 70 degrees. We get fresh sprouts. Those fresh sprouts will be very high in hydrogen cyanide or prussic acid. Also, after a frost, like I'd mentioned earlier, we've had some pretty widespread frosting and on some of these cool mornings. Now they may not be killing frosts, but what they'll do is they will damage some of the outer leaves and will release some of this prussic acid, where it could be very dangerously and toxic if animals consume them. Okay, so we need to understand, all right, well, we have this issue. We maybe had some new sprouts. We did have some frost. And all of a sudden, boom, we did have a killing frost. Okay, great. How long do you wait? Well, roughly if you wait at least 7 days, you wait a week, it should dissipate and get absorbed back into the atmosphere. Okay, so it does go down, it does go away, but we need to understand that time frame is critical, because if we do turn cattle out, they don't adjust to it. Right. They will consume it, and they will start to have clinical signs within 15 to 20 minutes. And when I say clinical signs, I mean it is rapid. Labored breathing. They will go into convulsions. They'll be foaming out of the mouth. And eventually they will fall over, and they can die very rapidly. Okay, so that is true to the T. Hydrogen cyanide poisoning or prussic acid toxicity, whatever you may want to call that, happens rapidly, and we need to be aware of that. It happens right after we turn cattle out. So what are the things that we need to look for? What do we do if we do turn out cattle and all of a sudden we see some of these symptoms? Number one is get the cattle out of the pasture. Get them out as soon as possible. You have to remove those animals from that at-risk feed. Unfortunately, I'll be honest with you, treatment of a clinical signs, it's not often rewarding. Okay, a lot of the times it happens, and it's such a rapid toxin that we don't have enough time to catch up. And what happens is this prussic acid, or this hydrogen cyanide, what it does is it inhibits the body's cells from taking oxygen from the bloodstream. So here we have an animal that is breathing, is oxygenating its blood, but the cells can't utilize it. They can't pull that oxygen out of the bloodstream. So essentially they asphyxiate. And it does happen rapid. So one thing to keep in mind is never turn out cattle hungry. Okay, if you're going to utilize some of these crop residues, fill them up. Okay, make sure that they are full up on hay or whatever ration you're feeding them in the morning, and turn them out into that field in the afternoon. Okay, we just want to make sure that they're not going to go and rapidly graze all at one location and kind of mob graze as soon as we turn them out.
You want a transition period.
We want a transition period. So that may mean that, okay, we're putting the baled feed stuff that they're used to consuming, maybe we're putting some of that out in the field with them for a day or two to make sure that they acclimate themselves to the new feed, because we don't want to turn them out hungry. If you leave with one thing after listening to this program is make sure you feed your animals before you turn them out into a new crop residue field. Now, one thing that often gets confused about is here we have prussic acid, and they get exposed 15, 20 minutes. They're showing some of these clinical signs. Another similar issue that we can run into that has very similar clinical signs but is very different is nitrate toxicity. If we have stressed plants, it can't utilize the nitrogen that it's pulled up from the soil, and all of a sudden it sits in the stem. Okay, where prussic acid, the leaves are what's most toxic. Actually, in nitrates, it accumulates in the lower stem. So we have that to contend with. But if we turn those cattle out, yes, we can see if they get a really hot feed, and all of a sudden, yes, we can have abortion storms, we can have rapid death. It's a very similar clinical signs. However, it's the exact opposite mechanism. Okay, what happens is what we call methemoglobinemia, that the animals are breathing, but they can't carry any oxygen in their blood. So those are kind of the two that are the biggest at risk, either nitrate toxicity, especially from our drought, that this has been stemming full season, that we may have some nitrate issues, and then prussic acid. That's recently with the moisture, the regrowth, and then frost. Okay, all of that kind of brings into a perfect storm that we could be dealing with both of these.
And before we move on, the point here, if you have any suspicions of the presence of either of these, have that forage tested first.
Absolutely. Sample. We can make the best management decisions with good quality facts, and facts come from laboratory results. Okay, if we know what the risk is, we know how to utilize it. If we need to wait an extra week due to prussic acid, we can absolutely do that and still be able to safely utilize that forage. Okay, so, and then nitrates, obviously we can do blending, we can do some different things where we can still utilize these resources, but we understand the risk potential.
Stand by if you would, AJ. We've more we want to get into here in as far as possible crop residue dangers as we would turn cattle out on that residue. AJ Tarpoff is our guest on Agriculture Today. He's a beef veterinarian, K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with AJ shortly here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today returns now on the K-State Radio Network. Across the way is beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff of K-State Research and Extension. We're having a conversation with A.J. today about things that you cattle producers need to be fully alert to as you would turn your cattle out on crop residue post-harvest this year. Things that could be lurking in that residue, bringing harm potentially to your herd. A.J. shared a few thoughts before the break on such things as acidosis problems, potentially prussic acid or nitrate presence in that residue likewise, and how to manage around those. Now, AJ, we've had this interruption in harvest in many locations because of the rainfall, and that has begat buildup of molds and potential toxins lingering likewise, right?
Unfortunately, yes. So some of these molds, we've kind of had a perfect storm this year, okay? And I say that because usually these molds and what we consider mycotoxins coming from specific molds. We've had stressed plants. We started off with a drought, which stressed the plant. All of a sudden we did get full growth. We got to harvest season, and all of a sudden we got all this rain and moisture, which delayed harvest. And we've had prime conditions to enhance that mold growth standing out in the fields. And unfortunately, it's the longer we wait, the worse it possibly could get, but we don't know yet. Okay? We don't know yet until we get out in those fields and we actually look at what's happening. Now, the issue with some of these mycotoxins is a multitude of different factors. Some of them, like aflatoxins, can actually affect the liver. Okay, so while looking at the animal, you're not so sure if something is going wrong with it. If they consume a massive amount of aflatoxin all at once, and this is in the parts per billion, mind you, yes, we can have some of these cows go into liver failure. They'll get icteric or jaundice. They'll turn yellow, which we can't confuse that with anaplasmosis, which would have similar symptoms. But again, we can run into these issues, especially in a year like this. We need to be cognizant of what is out in our crop residue fields. Now, the thing to consider is just because you see some type of mold doesn't mean it's dangerously toxic, okay? But some molds will absolutely be thriving with some of the toxin-producing funguses and molds that are out there.
And that can't be detected with the naked eye per se, or can it?
No. So we have to send in samples. We have to know what the risks are, even after harvest, okay? At the harvest of the grain, we can have some of these mycotoxins actually in the grain itself. Anything associated with it, yes, we can actually harbor quite a bit of those mycotoxins all at once. And again, everything from mycotoxins to ergot alkaloids, if we're utilizing some of more of our wheat triticale type species, we can run into some issues there with ergots that actually it messes with peripheral blood flow, where we can actually get ears and tails to start to crinkle up and fall off, similar to frostbite, but it's actually from blood flow. They kind of look like fescue calves. All the way to zearalenone, that we can actually run into issues with high levels of hormone activity in the animal that can affect reproduction. It can affect some of our growing heifers. So all of these things are to consider, and the only way to understand what our risk is to test your feed. Go to your county extension office, talk to your county agent, and talk to your veterinarian. We all have resources that are available to be able to test these forages, to test these crops, to test these grains to ensure that they're safe for our animals to consume.
Now, in the case of molds or toxins, the class of animal does make a difference. The older animals might be a little more tolerant than the younger stock would.
Well, it depends. Do we have a lactating animal? Because the growing calf out of the lactating cow from, say, a fall calving herd could be greatly at risk because some of those toxins can go through the milk. Pregnancy status is critical. If we have a pregnant cow consuming some of these toxins, we can either cause abortions, we can cause some mutagenic effects to that developing calf. So those are two kind of very at-risk, groups. If we have an older, weaned, more mature growing animal, say we've got a fresh weaned group of calves, can we utilize some of those feedstuffs to help grow them? It all depends. It all depends on the level. So yes. Does it matter by class? Yes. Can we still utilize some of these crops, some of these grains? The answer is yes. But we need to know the risk with the class of animals that's associated with before we start feeding any of these. That's where our testing comes in.
That's where that analysis comes in handy with recommendations on how you can safely use that crop stubble out there, whether there's molds or not, and how intense they might be. Now, we're also worried basically about the entire nutritional plane of the herd beyond just the health dangers here. And you strongly endorsed the idea of assuring adequate vitamin intake coupled with that forage, right?
Absolutely. So energy, protein, those are our big ones, right? We need to make sure that we reach all those goals to get the adequate nutritional basis going into the winter. But one specific thing I do want to bring up that we can't forget about going into winter like this is vitamin A. Okay, vitamin A, it's always found in green, lush-growing grasses, but what did we have throughout most of Kansas? We've had drought this year. Okay, so unfortunately that beta-carotene and the carotene that would be in that lush-growing forage that our animals should have consumed, unfortunately the body stores in the liver of vitamin A coming into the winter may be lower than in years past. So I throw that out as a warning to just say, okay, so we don't end up with some of our weak calf pregnancy type issues late in gestation during the winter months. Start your vitamin A supplementation now. Okay, and that can be performed throughout whether you do have a proper vitamin and mineral package that is being supplied free choice for our cattle, especially going into a crop residue that inherently is going to be very brown, very low in vitamin A. Proper supplementation to ensure that we have good levels throughout gestation for our pregnant cows going through the winter. Now is the time to start considering that, and and to start thinking about it.
And Free Choice will get it done as far as presentation of that vitamin A.
It should. Now, keep in mind, last year we did have quite a few supply issues with vitamin A. Most of those have become fixed, so that there should be much cheaper, should be a little bit more available than what we've had especially last year where we had some of the shortage issues. Go talk to your feed provider. Make sure that you can get a good supply of that. It's always good to be proactive to start thinking about things before you're turning them out onto a dormant forage rather than playing catch-up in very late gestation.
Any other minerals to worry about here, AJ?
That's always the biggest one to consider. I really wanted to focus on vitamin A, but a complete base mineral package is very critically important all through gestation. I think about calf health even while it's still in the pregnant womb, and proper trace mineral balance, not just the big ones, not just like our phosphorus and our calcium and everything. That needs to be balanced, but also our trace minerals to make sure that the immune status of that developing fetus grows into a very good developed immune system as a newborn calf. So keep that in mind. It's not just one in particular. This is a whole package. We can't single one thing out, but we do need to make sure that we have everything supplemented to these cattle going into winter.
And one more consideration here. It's so basic, one might think it's not worth mentioning, but it is. Clearly, when you're turning out cattle on a field of stover, water resource may not be handily available, the natural resource. So you're going to be providing water, and you need to watch that quality, don't you, on a consistent basis?
Absolutely. So water quality is everything. Water quality and water quantity. Right. Do the calculation. How much water do we have out in this tub, in the stubble field? Okay, how much water do our animals need on a daily basis? I understand it's pretty expensive to haul water on a daily basis, but we really hurt performance, and we affect the health of both cattle and calves, growing stocker type animals that we're backgrounding. Water quality and quantity is critically important. Be careful about if you are hauling water. You don't typically haul water, although a lot of our producers that have never hauled water were hauling water this year. Don't use old fertilizer tanks. It sounds like it's common sense, but the nitrogen we can't clean that out enough. Some of the nitrate levels can be extremely toxic high coming out of some of those fertilizer tanks. We can't double use those for water supply.
In fact, there have been wrecks to that effect here recently.
There have. So just an easy reminder. I know most of you, know that and have known it for years, but some of you that may be utilizing a new resource because of the drought or something like that doesn't typically haul water, make sure that it's a water-only use tank. Make sure that we're bringing plenty of water to these animals on a consistent daily basis. And once we get into the colder months, if they're still out on stubble, that either having a true heater to get into those water tanks to make sure it doesn't freeze. These are all things to have prepared and ready to go before you have to start utilizing it. So kind of assembling the troops, assembling the forces that we need to get these cattle through the winter months. It's a good idea to start now.
A whole slew of things to consider here before you turn cattle out on that crop stover. But in closing, it's also a very economical and highly valuable feed resource for producers to capitalize on. So if they just take the risks into account, AJ, this grazing will pay off.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one great thing about the cattle industry is the ruminant animal can utilize so many different feed resources. Okay, we're adding nutrients back into the field. We're getting some of this crop residue off that we can feed and maintain these cows during gestation. It's a system-based approach that really works well in all accounts. So it's an excellent resource available. This is a calculated management program that we understand what the risks are going in. We put those cattle out in the recommended period of time so we don't have any risk to those cattle, and then we graze them out for the appropriate amount of time. Remember that we don't want to overgraze some of those residues because there wouldn't be enough energy later on in some of those grazing opportunities. So things to keep in mind, but yes, valuable resource to help get these girls through the winter.
We appreciate your time, AJ. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's AJ Tarpoff, beef veterinarian with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. And now over to today's agricultural news headlines. And it's evident we're still a ways before we finish up this prolonged fall harvest in Kansas. That's confirmed in this week's numbers from the USDA. For the week ending this past Sunday, topsoil moisture supplies in the state were rated at 25% surplus and 71% adequate, 4% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 12% surplus and 80% adequate, only 8% short to very short. Winter wheat planting in the state at 67%. That's behind the 80% for the 5-year average. Emergence is at 53%. That's very near the average for the date. The corn harvest in Kansas, then, 69% complete. That's behind the 75% average. Soybean harvest, 23% in, well behind the average of 51% for the date. And the grain sorghum harvest at 23%. That's behind the average of 40% for this date in Kansas. For the national numbers on corn and soybean harvest progress now, we turn to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says the corn harvest is approaching the halfway mark nationwide.
49%. That is holding on just slightly ahead of the 5-year average, which is 47%, and well ahead of last year's 37%.
Dry weather has been favorable for field work.
And it's interesting to note that harvest progress during the last week was 10% of the overall acreage, and that compares to a grand total of 13% during the previous 2 weeks.
He especially noted Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota, where harvest progress was made, although all 3 states are still behind their 5-year averages.
Corn conditions steady for the week. No change in the good to excellent rating, 68%. Nor the very poor to poor rating at 12%.
That is slightly ahead of corn condition last year at this time. Soybean harvest progress this week outpaced corn.
Producers generally going after the more fragile soybeans first where possible, and as a result we saw a nice 15-point increase during the week in overall soybean harvest progress, going from 38 to 53%.
Despite the progress, the nation is still behind last year's 67% and the 5-year average of 69%.
But we did see some tremendous progress taking place in the previously saturated and soaked upper Midwest.
He especially noted soybean harvest progress in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota.
Like corn, no change in the condition rating for the week ending October 21st. We're still at 66% good to excellent, 11% very poor to poor. That is better than last year's 61% and 12% respectively.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
While the USDA is working with United States pork producers to increase biosecurity efforts and vigilance for signs of African swine fever, the department is also doing all it can to keep the African swine fever virus out of the U.S. in the first place. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
With African swine fever spreading across hog facilities in China and now into Eastern Europe,
concern about African swine fever has been elevating.
Undersecretary of Agriculture Greg Eibach says USDA is elevating its efforts at keeping this viral disease of swine out of the U.S. It doesn't affect humans, but when pigs get it, it's nearly 100% fatal, spreads easily, no cure, no preventative vaccine. And so first,
we've upped our surveillance at the border in cooperation with Customs and Border Protection.
And with some help from USDA's Beagle Brigade, specially trained dogs that can sniff out things that people coming into the U.S. should not be bringing in with them. The other day, one beagle led inspectors at the Atlanta airport to a roasted pig's head in the luggage of somebody from Ecuador. That head could have been carrying the African swine fever virus.
And so it's those types of screenings that we need to have in place to keep it off North American soil.
If it got into commercial hog facilities, it could cause huge losses for the U.S. pork industry. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington. Washington.
And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Time now for this week's feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State, Milk Lines. With that, as always, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the late harvested forages. Looks like winter has arrived in most areas of Kansas a little early this year, and we're likely to have some fairly heavy killing frost. And in some areas it may not quite be totally killing, but at least will set some of our forage crops back. So as we look at our alfalfa fields and sorghum fields that are yet to be harvested, in some areas we actually still have some corn silage that'll maybe be coming out of the fields as well. What are some things that we should consider? Well, first off, as you look at these frosted forages, you need to be thinking about the whole plant dry matter. As the frost causes the leaves to dry, we'll see dry matters drop in many cases fairly quickly. So we may end up with some forages that are fairly high in dry matter and will not ferment very well. This is complicated because with cooler temperatures, the active fermentation process is generally slower and also takes longer to complete. So keep that in mind if you're harvesting forages that contain 40% or more dry matter. Some other things to be concerned about. We have very wet fields in many areas, so this will further delay our ability to be able to get on these fields quickly after the frost and begin harvesting of the crops. So as you think about that, some things that may happen, particularly with sorghum crops, is that we may start to see a regrowth, particularly if we have warmer weather and with adequate soil moisture. This regrowth may result in the presence of prussic acid. So please be aware that as you're harvesting these sorghum forages, to make sure that we do not have some new regrowth that has started due to the weather conditions that we're having. If you do see new regrowth, you need to maybe hold off harvest a week or so to allow the prussic acid levels to drop in the forage and to prevent issues with your animals. Some other things to consider as you look at these late harvested forages is how you're going to store them. If you're going to be harvesting these forages late, you may consider bagging, particularly if you're a smaller producer. One of the reasons for that is you maintain a smaller face, and it will also help if we have forages that are higher in dry matter and do not pack well into a bunker. So a smaller face, as well as an oxygen-limiting situation in storage, may help with the fermenting of these particular forages, and will also help you on the feed-out, particularly with herds of less than 300 cows. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider their options when looking at these late harvested forages that have been damaged by frost.
Thanks, Mike. And our weekly chat about wildlife management with K-State's Charlie Lee is coming your way after this final break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. And next up, our weekly wildlife segment. Charlie Lee is aboard, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Well, Charlie, pet owners who allow their pets to be out and about often have a fear of coyote attacks. There's a new study that takes a look at that, but is this a prevalent problem?
Well, it's not one that I keep statistics on, but I would guess that I hear of a coyote-dog interaction at least twice a month that ends in a bad way. Most of those are when the coyote is acting aggressive and the dog then serves as prey or as a competitor to the coyote, and often the pet is attacked, injured, or killed. And that's really a fear for a lot of people that walk their dogs either on or off leash in neighborhoods and parks, open spaces where coyote densities may be higher. We seem to be getting higher densities of coyotes in suburban and urban areas. So it just seems to be building to a point that we're going to need to do some things to try to minimize these risks with coyotes and pets. It's long been known that the relationship between coyotes and house cats could be characterized as a predator-prey situation. If you look at the information of other studies out there, shows that cats have been estimated to be as high as 22% of coyotes' diet in urban areas, but more typically it's in that 8 to 13% range. When you look at the percent of dog that has been found in coyote scat, it's much lower. It's generally been detected with less than 1% frequency in coyote scats. So that would suggest that coyotes are not killing dogs as a food item. That predation behavior would be relatively rare. So even though the predation event may not be very prevalent, there are lots of other reports out there of conflicts and interactions with coyotes and pets that include coyotes attacking or injuring dogs, or in some cases playing with dogs.
And this was the subject of a recent study out of the University of California to document these coyote-dog interactions. Is that correct?
Yes, that would have been one of the objectives of the study. They took a rather unique approach to gather information. As you can imagine, it would be fairly difficult for one individual to get a lot of images of coyote-dog interaction because it just does not occur that frequently. So they use social media. In fact, they use YouTube video clips that were taken from October to December of the year 2014. They searched all of those clips using various search terms and ended up with 35 video clips that showed at least one coyote and at least one dog interacting in some manner.
And that, in fact, broke out 4 behaviors, if you will, you say.
Yeah, the 4 behaviors would have been predatory. They characterized that as being a stalking, an ambush, or an attack with the presumed intent to capture. And since coyotes often kill prey by a bite shake to the head or neck, that was part of the predatory behavior. The agonistic is just aggression or fighting. That's biting or lunging with or without contact, and that could even include chasing or running after. The other one was social play. That's play chase or play flee, play bow, or other types of play invitation where you may have seen dogs just flop on the ground, quickly pivot and run off hoping that someone else chases them. And the other category was undetermined, where it was a very low interest or simply avoidance of the other animal. Well, when they broke those out, they had about 10% of those 35 interactions were in the predatory behavior, with 3 videos showing the coyotes doing head shakes or bite shakes on small dogs. All small dogs escaped during the video sequences. One of those small dogs escaped only when another larger dog ran in and attacked the coyote. There were 26% of those interactions that they characterized as agonistic, and that was based primarily on biting, lunging, or snarling, or snapping, or crouching down with bared teeth. Most of those were coyotes after dogs. It was not very frequently observed that the dogs were being agonistic towards the coyotes. And then 26% of those 35 video clips illustrated playful behaviors where there was no attempt to be aggressive or predatory.
So when you consider those numbers, one might draw the conclusion that coyotes are having somewhat minimal impact on dogs in this respect.
Yes, I would certainly agree with that, but it just takes one predatory event to get the neighborhood upset. Okay. And oftentimes there are some things that can be done to prevent those types of behaviors, but people have not yet learned that that's going to be the way of the future, that they've not yet had to take those steps to protect their pets.
So what can, for example, one do to keep these interactions from happening?
Well, one of the first would be don't feed the coyotes, whether that's actively feeding, putting out food specifically for coyotes, or inadvertently feeding coyotes by leaving garden produce available or bird seed on the ground, pet food fed free choice outside. Those are some of the things that are going to get coyotes up and accustomed to coming into an area. We want to keep coyotes wild. Another thing that's difficult for some to accept, if you have a small dog, walking that dog off leash is probably not the best thing to do in an area if you're in an area of high risk. The other is always be there for your pet. If you let your pets out at night in an unfenced area, in a high-risk area, meaning you've seen coyotes exhibiting that predatory behavior or agonistic behavior before, that's inviting trouble. You can simply build an exclusionary fence to let your dog in and let them free roam in that situation within the barrier. I think one of the key things is we need to make sure coyotes continue to be afraid of humans.
Well, it's an interesting study, again, out of the University of California, and it did record what happens between dogs and coyotes as they would happen to cross each other's paths. Charlie, thanks for a look at this. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Our time's away for today. Thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.